In this episode, we speak with Brook Turner, Director of Partnerships at Visionwest Community Trust. With over 20 years' experience across social innovation, Brook is a senior social impact leader working at the intersection of partnerships, systems change, and community-led innovation. In this conversation, Brook shares his journey into the housing and homelessness sector, beginning with early youth development work that exposed the realities of youth homelessness in Aotearoa. We explore the systemic drivers of housing insecurity, the importance of prevention, particularly through youth-focused interventions, and what truly works in sustaining tenancies long-term. Brook also discusses the role of partnerships, intergenerational housing models, food security, and the need for more integrated cross-sector approaches. Looking ahead, he outlines bold practical ideas for system-level change, from rethinking housing models and financing to unlocking land and scaling community-led solutions that could transform outcomes for future generations. More information on this episode can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Cha Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.
Brook, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Really appreciate that you've got a lot on, as we all do in the sector, and thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today. So good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thanks, man.
Hey, could we start? Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and what brought you into the work that you do with Visionwest?
Yeah, sure. So I've always had a passion for the not-for-profit. I've been involved in sort of charitable work since being a teenager. What led me into the charitable area was actually youth development. And in my 20s, I was involved in setting up a number of different sort of youth-oriented organisations in New Zealand and founded a creative youth organisation called Zeal that basically developed young people using creativity as the medium, so music, drama, art, social entrepreneurship, those sorts of things. We set up a range of youth centres around the North Island, and actually when we set up a youth centre in West Auckland, in our first week of being open, we realised that there were 10 kids living under the Henderson Bridge who were homeless. And so that was my first sort of interaction with homelessness that we had ever had. We sought to work with the different agencies and groups around getting those young people housed, and there was just nothing for them. There was literally nowhere for them to go. That really hit me and led me to begin to explore inequality and homelessness and, sort of poverty in New Zealand, sort of broader than the youth development part of work that I was in. And I read Inequality in New Zealand Crisis, which was like a Max Rashbrook project, and also The Spirit Level, which was an international book around equality and equity. And then, cut a long story short, that led me to a conversation with Lisa Woolley, and here I am.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And in those early days, those formative days for you, when you were looking at the persistent unmet housing need in the communities that you were serving, can you give us a sense of the mixture, the diversity of the people who you were engaging with?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing was, all the kids living under the bridge were Māori, and, we found that the system was literally letting go of these kids, so they would be, some of them were involved in, sort of violent crime. They came from quite strong sort of intergenerational criminal activity, but they would be arrested, they'd go before the youth courts, they might go to a youth penitentiary, and then they're literally discharged into homelessness because they didn't want to go home. They didn't actually want to be in that environment of trauma. And then one of my youth workers actually, unbeknown to me, they leased a house warehouse on Henderson Valley Road and invited all the kids to come and live with them because the youth workers got so fed up of the system not providing for young people. And that really was also what happened with other young people. Like, we'd have youth workers go to the courts to accompany a young person on a charge, and then the young person would be sentenced to either go into juvie again, or the youth court judges said, if there's a bail address, we'll let the kid go to a bail address. And so again, unbeknown to me, remember, we're a creative agency running youth centres, not a social agency doing housing. Youth workers would give their bail address and allow a young person to come and crash on their couch in their flat, which, it breaks all the rules, right? Like, let's be clear, this was breaking rules, and I had a real dilemma as a CEO. But again, I was saying to myself, and I was getting really impacted, like, what's happening for me in this? And actually there's a systemic issue here, because as I began to engage with older people on the streets, I realized that they were first homeless when they were young people. So I was like, well, to deal with homelessness, maybe it needs to start with this youth part, not to say that it's much wider than that, but that was the entry in. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful context. And so tell us about the work you're currently doing with Visionwest and beyond. I know there's a lot on, but just interested to see how this is evolving as you continue to lean in.
Yeah, sure. So my role is Director of Partnerships. So I basically work with our Tauihu leadership, our shared leadership with Mātua, Fred and Lisa, to look at the stakeholder relationships and the community relationships we need to have to address the greatest needs in our community. And so I'm involved in new ventures that are either partnerships in the sector, partnerships with government, with philanthropy, with other sister agencies. Some of the really interesting work we're doing at the moment is that we're currently redeveloping our Glendale campus in Glen Eden in West Auckland, and that's a 3-part program of work where we've got 24 apartments that are being built right now. They're in 2 sections, 2 blocks of 12. It's really cool. The bottom level are disability accessible housing, because we know how much those with disabilities, and particularly the deprivation rates rising for our kaumātua kuia. So they'll be able to come and be housed there. The middle levels will be sort of mums with kids, and about 60% of those who are homeless who present to Visionwest are mums with children. And then the upper level will be rangatahi one-beddies. In the middle of that, we have this beautiful community room where that community, the hope is that we'll have intergenerational connections between those 3 demographics. So that's really exciting. We've just done a feasibility study on intergenerational living in an intergenerational learning centre, which is actually about elderly housing with early childhood education. So this is quite a big model of housing overseas, where when older people have more interaction with younger people, it increases life expectancy, and when very young children have interaction with older people, it increases educational aptitude. So that's just in sort of a formative stage. And then we are also thinking about and working on, what it means for Pacifica sort of intergenerational housing. And we have Judy Matai, as you know, who's our Director of Housing and Pacifica Development. So as we, so many 1 and 2 beddies being built, government saying we need more 1 and 2 beddies, yet we've got over 100,000 people and overcrowding in South Auckland, many of them are our Pacific whanaunga. How do we support them? So that's a bit of the work in the housing space that I do. I do a bunch of other partnership work as well, but we'll keep it to housing for now.
Awesome. Really interesting research came out recently from Urban Advisory, putting forward the concept, obviously there's many different drivers, economics and cost of living being one of them, but a realisation that multi-generational living's actually become a thing that is no longer typified just culturally as a Māori and Pacific cultural paradigm, but actually seems to be broadening out into whole of society as a way of living that delivers better outcomes for everybody. Are you seeing evidence of that in West Auckland?
Yes. What we're seeing as well is basically, you would have experienced this with many groups, but typically when we house a person or we house a whānau, we end up dealing with the inevitability that more people are in that house than were initially housed, right? And I think it speaks you know, the experience I've seen in housing, because I get to go and interview a bunch of these people for our annual report and our storytelling, because I look after the marketing and storytelling part of the trust as well. And it comes from their empathy, like someone did something for me, so I'm going to do something for, my sister needs a place to crash. Well, of course, I'm going to invite her in. My mum, it's unsafe for her where she is, or she's in a damp place, I invite her in without the permission of the chip, But to your point, it's not just actually in that lower socioeconomic level as well. Like, more and more of our working families in Auckland are having to make intergenerational choices. And I think in that, it's interesting. I know we'll talk about the system a bit later, but, we've still got this sort of nuclear family philosophy of lending when it comes to mortgages that doesn't take into consideration intergenerational ontological security. Yeah.
Yeah, good example of systemic structural issues that make it difficult. Yeah, look, I'm aware you've done some really interesting work with Manaaki Rangatahi and looking at the research drivers of youth homelessness. Can you talk to us about some of the things that you've seen that are working well that we could all do more of more often and in more places? What's that brought to the surface for you, that piece of work?
Yeah, really great question. Well, I guess the first thing is, overwhelmingly we see that who are homeless are feeding the adult homelessness issue that New Zealand is facing. So young people who are connected to the justice system, young people who come out of care, young people who have mental health and addiction struggles, and also the effects of colonisation and racism. So, our rangatahi Māori are overrepresented in those stats. The reason I say that, I know you're saying what are the solutions, is like the first solution is for us to recognise that youth housing isn't a thing for youth workers, and it's not a separate thing to solving homelessness. Like, we've got this idea of like, oh yeah, we should do something for the young people. Like, we're going to go and make a skate park, except in this case, it's housing for youth. I don't actually believe that. Like, and the research doesn't say that as well. The research actually talks about addressing youth homelessness, and they're not the only cohort that drive homelessness and drive adult homelessness, so I want to be clear about that, but they are the area that I have expertise in. It addresses adult homelessness. And so it's a preventative approach to long-term homelessness, is working with young people. And if we relate it to the benefit system, if you can divert a young person who's not in education, training or employment from going on benefit, you basically save 12 to 15 years of benefit payments from the taxpayer, right? So the ROI of actually getting kids into work, I heard the stat this week, 32,000 New Zealanders between the age of 16 and 25 are without employment right now. Constantly, since I was a youth worker, it's always double or 3 times the adult rate. The reason why we need to emphasise on youth again is that it prevents this downstream effect, and I think it was Desmond Tutu that said, there's only so long that you can pull people out of the river before you need to walk upstream and see who's pushing them or what's pushing them in. Yeah. And the same applies to homelessness, right? So what we see is that when you have groups like Mata Huruhuru in South Auckland, led by Mahira Maihi, that's a kaupapa Māori youth housing and youth education provider, she is connecting a MSD program called He Po Tamarangatahi, which is an education and employment pedagogy, with her He Pa Piranga youth transitional housing, and getting phenomenal outcomes, because the work isn't isolating and putting into silos. Oh, this young person needs employment, go over there. This person needs housing, go over there. This person needs cultural connection, go over there. It's bringing it all together. And that is so powerful in bringing transformation. So I do think in the youth housing area as well, it's not just housing. It's like once young people are housed, like everyone who's listening to this knows, if your teenager's at home in their house by themselves with nothing to do in perpetuity, that's not a great thing, right? Like we want our youth out experiencing things. So that's what I love about what I'm seeing with the Manaaki Rangatahi work.
Beautiful response, and it picks up a lot of the themes that have appeared as we have pulled together the research and the conversations for this next edition of the Insight Report, where a lot of people commented on people falling through the gaps. And many of those gaps were expressed as manifestations of state agencies' inability and lack of willingness to work with each other. And I love the clarity of let's do what works instead, because that's clearly a shining example of something that is working extraordinarily well. Hey, from your experience of delivering housing first and wraparound support, would you mind talking about what your observations are of what actually works in helping people to sustain a tenancy long term?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the real key things is to think about ontological security. So ontological security for listeners is the security of your environment. So say I've lived in my house with my kids for 11 years. So they know every street, they know their neighbours, they know the local park, they know the person down at the local dairy, they know all those things. And so if my wife or I was to fall out of employment or something to happen to our kids, our neighbourhood actually knows us. So our neighbourhood will support us. That doesn't happen with people who get rehoused, like these temporary housing options for people, whether it's a night-by-night accommodation or transitional housing, people just bounce. Now, if you bounce between houses, that impacts your ontological security.
And Brooke, just so I think I understand, ontological sort of like the things that you learn by doing them, by lived experience. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. And it's the familiarity with those things and building deeply in a sense of place. So even as simple as I know how to work my washing machine and I don't get anxiety about using it because I've been moved to 3 houses and the washing lines and the washing machines are all in different places. Like it can be really, really simple things. The power of housing first is that when you house someone with no readiness criteria and you put them in that house, you say, this is your home, this is your permanent home. Now, what do you want to work on? And that's key too, right? Because the key worker might see a whole bunch of things like we do with people that we love and want to help, there's all these things that probably my family look at me and go, hey, Brooke needs this help. But what does Brooke want to work on? What does Paul want to work on? And so when you've got that security of that house, you're going to be there, you're not going to be moved again, that you can begin to work on those things. And we've seen that be really, really simple things. Like sometimes it's learning to cook, sometimes it's just understanding how to engage with an application to do a bridging course or some kind of education thing because they've never had the opportunity to do that. What's amazing is the small wins lead to bigger wins over time. And that is transformational. So it's like, you taught me to clean my fridge. Now I want to go get a job. I got my kids into school. Now, I want to start working on that trauma stuff that I've got. Can I see someone once a week? Is there a counselling referral? Rather than doing to someone, it's the walking with them. So I think that's the most transformative thing in housing first.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's it's under pressure as a both a philosophy, but more so as a program. There's been massive defunding and disinvestment in the Housing First program in the USA just recently. And I think we are concerned that in an effort to cut costs, the mistake will be made in New Zealand to reduce rather than increase housing first, because it's a false economy. You might get a short-term saving, but long-term, what I'm hearing you say is this is life-changing and ultimately will lead to better outcomes.
Absolutely. And the thing I think that New Zealand's done wrong is that, we're relatively inexperienced in our housing pedagogy, in terms of response to homelessness, I mean. So we call Housing First a program, and it's a program of government that is now commissioned. But Housing First is actually an approach. Like, we could take Housing First and go, what's the approach of Housing First and how does it connect with Papakāinga, right? What's an approach of Housing First and how does it work in a Pacifica environment? How does it work for women? How does it work intergenerationally? How does it work for older people? What I think there is an issue with there as well is that in the New Zealand context, we've got this horrific thing that's amazing, but it's bittersweet, called IRRS. And the problem with IRRS is that it is very, very difficult to create once you've got the highway onto an IRRS subsidy into a house, to get the highway off in terms of employment is so difficult because of housing cost, right? So I've done the numbers over and over again to go, what's the employment program that you put alongside Housing First, or you put alongside any of our housing, to be frank, that actually incentivizes the mum or the couple or the older person to get into employment? And where is that, and how is it not a prejudice to that 25% of their income being on housing and them having 75%? And so I feel like we have some costly mechanisms that create a false picture of a broken housing approach, where actually we've got a lack of imagination and a lack of sophistication in terms of what those graduation off-ramps could be into independent housing, with employment and education supported for those who do really well. Now, the other thing that has to be said there is that housing is a human right, and there will be some people that need housing for a very long time, and it will be less costly to New Zealand and more empathetic to have them housed well with support for a long time, and that matters too.
Yeah, well put, Brooke. And this one's for you, Ministers of Finance, Ministers of Housing, Ministers of Social Development and Health and Mental Health. Hope they're listening, because it's a problem we all need to focus on and address, and it's a long-term fix that we're looking for there. Brooke, you've talked there a little bit about some externalities, and another one that I think is really important is cost of living and food security. And that's no more on our minds now than because of the food security shocks that will play out over the next 6 or 12 months as a result of the Iran conflict. I don't think most people have quite realised the deep implications into food security globally that will be caused by the logistics issues of the war. What have you learnt about food security and the kaupapa in our context? And how that connects, so that everything's connected, clearly.
It is connected, and actually housing and food are intrinsically connected. And, I'm involved in doing a lot of research in this space, and led our food response during COVID and have been a key part of it ever since then. The thing that I'll say is that is quite incredible is that families are choosing to pay housing costs, and the discretionary item they go without is food, because they don't want to be turfed out of their house, right? So when it comes to a utility cost or getting the arrears down because, they had to pay for the school uniforms, the car broke down or that sort of thing, and they've gone into rent arrears, instead of the first thing being like, now they do get driven to loan sharks, and there's a whole financial debt thing here as well. But food is being sacrificed to pay for housing, and that's to your cost of living issue. The thing that happens there is that the children get the food first, so mum and dad are not getting the food that they need, and that's having a detrimental effect on their health. So like with how I talked about with young people in housing, it's actually not a housing intervention we're trying to do. We're trying to prevent adult homelessness, and we're also trying to support young people to get a hope for their future in terms of employment and education outcomes for them, and housing might be part of that mechanism. In the same way, food security and our support for people to get enough food and enough nutritious food is actually health prevention. It's in that preventative part of health. And when 27% of New Zealand children are food insecure, when 1 in 3 Pacifica children are food insecure, that's massively problematic in New Zealand. 30% of mums in this country don't have enough food. So it's like, how can we expect our mums to go out and get a job? And I was just listening to one of the stories of an amazing whānau at Visionwest the other day called Evangeline, and she put it so succinctly. She said, before I came to Visionwest, I was just so tired and exhausted, and I was overwhelmed. And when I came to Visionwest, I realized it's because I wasn't eating enough.
Yep.
So it's like, just to get to that fundamental base of, I need to do some things in my life to get out of this pool of treacle that holds me down in poverty. I've got to have enough food. So I always think that those two are connected, housing and food. And the way I view it is a bit like housing first is an emergency room for homelessness, if you like, that community food support is an emergency room for food insecurity. Of course, we all want a benefit system and a government system that if someone falls out of housing, there's a response to them immediately and before it gets too dire. And we want that the same for food. Like, you should be able to rock up to a WINS, to an MSD service and get what you need to get through so you don't fall further. The problem is more and more New Zealanders are falling further.
Brooke, it's really inspiring hearing you talking about driving at root causes rather than just treating the symptoms. And I'd like to sort of move our conversation from the sort of practical coalface into a sort of a system conversation and with a future focus. What do you see as some of the largest both challenges and opportunities for whānau providers and the government within New Zealand society in relation to housing and security? What are some of the thoughts that come to mind within that? I suppose we're trying quite deliberately to focus on solutions because they energise people and they provide hope to people and they provide motivation and momentum. And so help us out here. What are your thoughts at a system level?
Yeah, so I'll take it I might start in a slightly different way that you might have thought. So I'm an advisory board member to the Idea Institute with Max Rashbrook, and I don't know if you saw, but recently Max and the Institute released the Child KiwiSaver report.
Yeah.
So basically, compound interest, right? Like, not many people understand it, but the number one thing I think we could do at a systems level is that every child that is born in New Zealand gets a KiwiSaver and it opens on their birthday, literally in hospital. The government puts $1,000 in and then puts a series of financial commitments year on year that are a Max's report, and you can go read it because I can't remember them offhand. My understanding is that with that modest investment from government, that depending on your income level as a household, you might have to put skin in the game. Like me and my family would put skin in the game for my kids or my kids' or whatever. That when that person turns 18, if they've had 18 years of KiwiSaver contributions, they'll have anywhere between $18,000 and $42,000. Now, if you understand compound interest, you know what's going to happen to that $42,000 between 18 and 30, right, with future payments. And here's just something for the listeners to understand. If you opened an investment fund when you were 18 and you gave $50 a week to it until the age of 65, you would have a return of between 780,000 and 1.7 million, right? We all don't save for retirement until we're old enough to be looking at it. Like it's just a fundamental principle. So the child KiwiSaver thing could be absolutely transformational. The link to it would be that you think about large intergenerational households and being able to work with our banking sector to say, look, we need an intergenerational lending product. We need 40 to 45-year mortgages, and we need to get away from this, just this sort of Western view that one person in the family has to be able to pay back this house because housing's just unaffordable, right? Suddenly, if it's my kid's income and their KiwiSaver and my income, and we can spread that repayment over 45 years or 40 years rather than 25, that the unlocking that happens is just absolutely incredible. The other thing that I think that we should do that's a much faster and more effective use is that there's a whole bunch of New Zealanders right now that earn the living wage that could and above that could pay and this is about at a systems level, right? Because we talk down the chronic end. I'm talking in the middle, like holding the middle so the middle doesn't fall. Basically, the idea would be that you look at households in New Zealand that on their rental capacity and what they're renting, they could afford to pay a mortgage. And then you use the KiwiSaver mechanism to do what we did in the early 1900s, which was we gave a Workers' Advancement, there was a Workers' Advancement Act where the government went guarantor on deposits for farms and properties, right? And many people got their family homes. Many of us, our inheritance actually, and how has come from that act. That the government does that again. And so this working class of Kiwis that are working really hard, that can't get ahead and pay their rent for their own homes, would effectively be have the government go guarantor, like those of us who have had parents who went guarantor for our first property. The government does that. And then your future KiwiSaver payments pay back that deposit because you're already paying. So I think at a systems level, that really works. I fear sometimes that in our sector, we talk so much about those who are going without and those who have fallen through the gaps and all of that. But actually, we've got to talk about the middle, and we've got to talk the middle lower, because if we can address that, then we have some mechanisms there to lift people into those spaces. Of course, another product is progressive home ownership. You probably know more about that one than I do. But I think those are a couple of the systemic things we need to do. The other thing we need to do, and this is fundamental, is that poverty is female in New Zealand and it has children. And we have a problem with the abatement rate in the benefit system. So right now, if I'm a mum, and I'm on benefit and I have to be a mum, right? I've got to be there for my kids. The guy's gone away. He's gone burgers. He's nowhere to be seen. He's not paying anything to the household. And I want my kids to do better. I'm limited with what I can do. As my kids grow, I want to work. But the problem is I can only take on casual work because I need to be there for the children. Currently, if I earn over $80 a week, I'm going to get penalised on my benefit.
$80.
Yeah, so you get penalised for, say I'm working in a restaurant and I just try to make the restaurant work when my mum can come and look after the kids. So that fluctuates based on what kids' needs are, right? Everyone understands that who are parents. I say no to the extra shifts from the boss because I'm going to be penalised with my benefit. Like, why does that exist? Like, how does that make sense? And of course, that's preventing mum getting to a place where her income could take her out of the KO home or out of the Visionwest home and into her own flat. And so that home's freed up for another vulnerable whānau, instead of this obsessive thing of we need to build more social houses because social needs got greater,
Brooke, have you thought has there been any work done on what an appropriate level might be that might help to fix that if we were to change that policy? Because I get the point you're making. We've got a problem in New Zealand where we're thinking of social housing as welfare. And we've been having that conversation quite broadly within the sector for a while in terms of trying to recategorise it as housing. Housing is housing, not housing as welfare. And I think where you're driving with this really helpful policy suggestion is that even changing the dial there to encourage the desired behaviour, which is growing employment, growing income of the household, is being impeded by the current settings. Where do we need to move them to?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally, I couldn't give you a number on the benefit because there's some really smart people, in MSD that would be able to give the number on that. But what I will say is that pay equity has to come back on the table because, to my point of poverty being female with dependents, if you're a female Pacifica mum in this country, you're earning on average 22% less than your white male counterpart in the same role. That's just wrong. Like, we're in 2026. How does that make any sense at all? So again, I think that when, if that happened to those hardworking roles like the cleaner, the support worker, the health workers in our hospital, the people who have got these crazy wage-based roles and then travel supplements that are lower than minimum wage, if we could fix the equity there, then those starting level employment opportunities that anyone can get into and then grow from there become a catalyst for breaking the cycle and helping people get into meaningful employment over time. So that would be, but I can't comment on a specific number.
No, that's okay. Thanks. No, we'll follow up offline because we've got connections there. Hey, I'm interested, whilst we continue to focus on ideas, policies, things that are working. You've just returned from a trip to Australia, looking at other housing models. What did you see, and was there anything that inspired you, uplifted you, gave you hope that we might be able to think about contextualising here in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Oh yeah, it was amazing. I mean, one thing that's just right at the tip of my tongue is we've been in this situation, and many chips are, where basically, we use our equity to buy more houses, right? But you get a group of houses, the mortgages get paid over a certain period of time, your equity rises, and you go, well, we want to do more, and you go again. But it's a stop-start process, right? In Australia, when I was meeting with housing providers, they all have had the same issue, but they do significant equity fundraising projects that fundraises the equity share to do housing projects when they have no equity. And just about every large chip is doing it. There's a whole fundraising industry that helps them with it. There's philanthropists in Australia and philanthropic trusts that understand that philosophy, right? Because they're looking at the ROI and they're going, man, all we have to do is put a 20% amount into this, and there's going to be a 4-to-1 return on our investment. And that makes total sense to us. And it's meant as well that those housing ventures happen in remote areas where the land cost and the development cost, isn't where you would typically go, where the money is. So I think equity, an equity share from non-government interested parties is something really interesting to think about. James Palmer, if you're listening out there, I know you're already doing work. I know you'll tell me it can happen this way, Brooke. But also philanthropists, if you're listening out there, don't think you don't have a role in housing. I get that we all see it as government needing to support the chips, and you're right. But you guys could be unlocking scale that actually gets us in this generation to a level where the chip sector in New Zealand has the volume to be able to do that piece ourselves. We are not yet there yet, as a generation, we could invest and that could happen. The one other thing I'll mention is we went and visited an Education First program in Melbourne. So Education First, they stole first from Housing First. But basically, back to my point earlier, they were saying, for young people, it's not housing first, it's education first. Because the thing that's going to make a kid not perpetually homeless is they get educated, they have a track and a pathway to their dreams, and they go on that. So how it works is they have what's called TAF, which are their equivalent of our polytechnics, and the Polytech offers up the land for free, and then the chip comes in alongside the Polytech, and together they fundraise to grow what's called a foyer model. So the foyer model, imagine student accommodation, like your listeners would have gone to it, university, but so between 20 to 100 rooms, just like dormitories, and then you have an area at the bottom which is like your shared kitchen and your lounge and your pool table and your hangout space and all of that, and then study spaces. But it's on university grounds. The Education First model is staffed by youth workers 24/7. So it's like, okay, these kids have fled risky environments, unsafe environments where there's been domestic violence, that sort of thing. It's not for your acute need young people. So it's not sort of really that chronic need where there might be substance abuse or gang affiliation or that sort of thing. But it is for those kids who are unsafe and they just find themselves bouncing and, they sort of get lost in the system, fall through the cracks, to use your words. The interesting thing is that when I've ever seen these environments, the youth workers that are meant to help the kids get educated, but in this model, each polytechnic, they have a tutor that comes from the university because it's right there because they're on the land, and they come and do all the tutoring with the kids. They do the career work with the kids. And so it just gets these phenomenal results. Like I was there and I met this guy called Douglas, and he's doing an engineer degree now. And he was homeless, and he's going to be an engineer. So I think models like that, where we can combine tertiary, their land, with housing, the chip capability, and government investment, could be transformational in the New Zealand environment too.
Fantastic. And in that example there, Brook, are those secondary school age young people?
They are young people from 16 onwards. So basically they start at 16. So they'll often come in where they've, like we all do, they've had their bumps, so they haven't quite got their high school quals to get them into that tertiary. And then they have the Polytech has a specific bridging program because there's a thing called the Foyer Foundation in Australia. So it's really understood right across the nation what this model is. And so they get their credits through that bridging course that then opens up the world to what they want to study.
Fantastic. It effectively bridges them into university entrance.
It does.
Or tertiary entrance, that's fantastic. I hadn't even heard of that. I love it. And I don't mind them stealing the name from Housing First because it's just a beautiful thing.
It is. I love Education First, actually. It's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, let's bring it to Aotearoa. That's a great idea. So any vice-chancellors out there from the university sector listening to this, let's get it going. Come on. It can't be that difficult if the Australians are doing it. Although the Australians told me they had a problem. I was over there recently and they said their big problem is at the moment they've got 4 trillion Australian dollars in their pension funds and not enough places to put it. So I did suggest they could be putting it into housing in New Zealand because that'd be a good investment. But there we go. Hey, Brook, as we sort of come to the close, I'm really interested, again, back at that systemic level, just to enter into that dream state, the art of the possible, the no limitations thinking of what are some of our biggest challenges in terms of creating long-term change in the New Zealand system. What sort of policy changes might we go for? We believe at Community Housing Aotearoa that we can actually solve our housing crisis and we can fundamentally address homelessness. We believe that's within our capability and capacity as a nation. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. I think we could. I think with us having the right intent and being insistent and consistent, we could change it in a generation. I think there's a couple of things that we need to think about. One is there's all this unlocked resource that could reduce the cost of housing if we're willing to think laterally, right? So we have a whole bunch of land that's held by different government agencies that was bought for a certain purpose. Maybe the neighbourhood resisted it. Maybe it's just sitting there. But we don't have any models of housing, or we have very few models of housing that are on long-term lease type arrangements on government land, right? So we've got some urban marae in Auckland that are on long-term leases on government land that, no one's going to change that because we all see the value of urban marae and what it's bringing in the kaupapa Māori and te ao Māori renaissance. Why can't that work on council land? Why can't council be supported with that? I think there needs to be support for the divestment of council flats to the chip sector in a way that's more intentional and significant, and particularly for our older people. I think that council and the chips and government have a responsibility right now to recognise that by 2050, 26% of over 65s will be renters and the pension won't work. So let's create the answer together for that. And that is absolutely possible, and it's possible right now. I think that the other thing is that we've got to get over this idea of covenanting. So there's a big issue with covenanting, the types of property and the extent in which people can have properties. So we've seen this amazing tiny home movement happen. Look, tiny homes aren't the answer to homelessness, but some people want to live tiny. And why aren't we opening up spaces where that can happen, again, on leased property, again, in places where, many people don't know how many people are living in boats right now in Auckland. How many people are living in boats? There is a huge community in Auckland that live in their boats, So what's the difference between your boat and the tiny home? And I still think we need to do some work on that. I think we fundamentally have an incrementalism problem in New Zealand. So what I mean by that is, and I'm speaking in the dream space, but I'm just saying, why couldn't we say, instead of incrementalism, let's do a fundamental shift here. Let's just decide, let's just decide together that we're not going to let anyone be homeless. Yep. Let's just make that fundamental decision, and then let's just be really creative like you and I are right now, and there'll be a whole bunch of really smart people out there that will come up with solutions. In that, there's one thing that I want to say that is separate to the youth thing that I think is really important. When we deinstitutionalised mental health in the 90s, we decided that we'd have a community approach to mental health. I totally agree with that. That's right. Those institutions needed to be shut down. The problem was there were people with significant mental health needs that went to the streets. And that group is still there. And you can try to house them, and they will bounce out of housing because there are actually mental health and addiction and acute psychosis issues that they face. Now, to me, a dignified nation looks for an intensive solution for them that's not move-on orders. It's actually move-in orders. It's actually, hey, come and be in assisted living. We're gonna walk with you in this. And I don't know what that looks like, but I do think we could do all the other things, and our street community will remain if we don't recognise we need an assisted living service for those in acute psychosis. And let's dream, let's do it together, let's be dignified, let's have compassion, let's have creativity, and let's see where that takes us.
Beautiful, Brooke. One of the things we've been talking about, which aligns very strongly with the vision you've outlined there, is this idea that as civil society organisations, faith groups, community providers, hapu iwi, we intentionally remove as much residentially zoned land and as many homes and apartments and houses and tiny homes as we possibly can, and permanently remove them from the market and retain them and recycle them as affordable housing for communities forever. Recognising that the market has limitations, and that those limitations are now, we have 40 years of cumulative evidence of what the limitations of the market are in Aotearoa. And for a growing number of our people, the market no longer serves and has perhaps never served their needs. And so as civil society, how do we intentionally, proactively, and to your point, boldly create that new system, which is based on dignity and compassion? And so that's something we're exploring as a concept, and it's not new. It already exists in the form of papa kāinga and community land trusts. And yeah.
That's great. And you know what? That makes me think, and you just sparked something in me, and I did have it in my notes to speak about, is that what is the vehicle that we could put church land into that could be interdenominational? And church leaders, if you're out there, great that we all work denominationally, but I don't think housing is drawn on those lines. Like, housing needs are not drawn on our denominational lines. So could we create a vehicle like that lease-based option I was talking about with council land? Could we do something similar that's a single vehicle? Because again, we all want to do this tiny little thing on the side in New Zealand. Like, I love the number 8 wire thing, but it is problematic to us when we're trying to respond to crisis at scale. Could there be a vehicle created that then in that vehicle, where you're able to build on church land? There's a bit in it for the church. Hey, we know that tithes and attendance numbers are sort of reducing in a lot of areas. This is a way for you economically to continue to flourish. There's a bit in it for the community sector. Hey, here's extra supply. And there's a bit in it for government and council. Why couldn't we look at that sort of vehicle as well? But we have to your point, Paul, and I love what you're saying, I think some of this is like, we have to get rid of our conditions. It's almost like you go unconditional on a house. That's what every seller wants, right? It's like we need to go unconditional on housing and solving homelessness. That's what we need.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Brooke, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your vision with us, and just want to thank you on behalf of the sector for the amazing work you do with your team and with the whānau you work with every day.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a privilege.
We'd like to thank Brook for taking his time to speak with us for this episode. More information on this episode can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Cha Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.